Jake wiped his dirty hands on an old rag for what felt like the 100th time that day. The grease never seemed to come off completely. His fingernails were permanently stained black, and his work clothes looked like they hadn't seen a proper wash in weeks. But that was the least of his worries right now. Standing in the middle of his father's old airplane repair shop, Jake looked around at the mess his life had become. Tools were scattered everywhere. Half-finished repair jobs sat, collecting dust, and the stack of unpaid bills on his desk seemed to grow taller every single day. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered constantly, casting weird shadows across the concrete floor that was stained with decades of oil and hydraulic fluid. This place used to be his pride and joy. Well, actually, it was his father's pride and joy first. Old Man Johnson had built this business from absolutely nothing back in the day. Jake could still remember being a little kid, watching his dad work magic on airplane engines that other mechanics had given up on. His father had this amazing gift for finding problems that nobody else could see and fixing things that seemed impossible to repair. But his father was gone now, had been for almost 10 years. Heart attack, sudden and brutal, right here in this very hangar. Jake had been working in the city then, making decent money at a big corporate job, wearing clean clothes and keeping regular hours. When he got the call about his dad, everything changed overnight. Someone had to keep the family business running. His mother couldn't do it alone, and Jake was the only one who knew anything about airplane mechanics. So he quit his comfortable job, sold his nice apartment, and moved back to this small town to take over Johnson Aviation Services. That was 10 years ago, and Jake was starting to wonder if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. The problem wasn't that he couldn't do the work. Jake was actually really good with airplane engines. He'd learned everything from his father during summer breaks and weekends when he was growing up. Plus, he'd spent 4 years in the Air Force working on military aircraft, so he knew his way around pretty much any flying machine you could imagine. The real problem was that being good at fixing planes and being good at running a business were two completely different things. His father had made it look easy, but Jake was discovering that keeping customers happy, managing money, dealing with suppliers, and handling all the paperwork was way harder than he'd expected. Competition was getting brutal too. The big maintenance companies from the city were moving into smaller airports, offering deals that Jake simply couldn't match. They had teams of mechanics, fancy equipment, and enough money to buy parts in bulk at discount prices. Jake was just one guy with a small shop and tools that were older than some of his customers. Every month brought new challenges. Last month, his biggest customer decided to take their planes to a larger facility 50 miles away. The month before, that his main part supplier raised their prices by 30%. And just last week, Jake had discovered that his insurance premiums were going up again because apparently his shop was considered high risk due to its age and location. Worst part was the bills. They never stopped coming. Rent on the hangar space, electricity that cost a fortune because of all the power tools and equipment, insurance, business licenses, parts inventory that tied up what little cash he had, and the loan payments on equipment he'd bought 3 years ago when things were looking more hopeful. Jake's personal life wasn't any better. His wife Lisa had tried to be supportive for the first few years, but the stress of never having enough money had slowly worn down their marriage. They'd started fighting about everything. Why he worked such long hours, why he couldn't just get a regular job like normal people, why he was so obsessed with keeping a business alive that seemed determined to die. The final blow came 2 years ago when Lisa told him she couldn't take it anymore. She'd found a job in another state and was moving with or without him. Jake chose the business and Lisa chose her sanity. He couldn't really blame her. Living paycheck to paycheck, never knowing if they'd be able to pay rent next month, watching Jake come home exhausted and covered in grease every single night. It wasn't the life she'd signed up for. Now Jake was alone, living in a tiny apartment above a convenience store, eating cheap takeout most nights because he was too tired to cook and too broke to eat anywhere decent. His mother kept asking when he was going to find someone new, but Jake couldn't imagine asking anyone to share this kind of life with him. The foreclosure notice had arrived 3 weeks ago. Jake had known it was coming, but seeing those official, legal papers still felt like a punch to the stomach. He had 30 days to come up with $15,000 in back payments plus interest and fees. 15,000 might as well have been 15 million for all the chance he had of raising that kind of money. He'd tried everything he could think of. Applied for loans at every bank in town, but his credit was shot and the business books looked terrible. Asked his few remaining customers if they could pay their bills early, but most of them were struggling too. Even considered selling some of his father's old tools, but they weren't worth much and he needed them to do his work. The crazy thing was that Jake was still getting calls for repair work. Just yesterday, someone had brought in a small plane with engine trouble, and Jake had diagnosed and fixed the problem in less than 2 hours. The customer was thrilled, paid his bill on the spot, and promised to recommend Jake to other pilots. But one small job wasn't going to save a failing business. Jake had started having the same nightmare almost every night. He'd dream about his father standing in the hangar asking why Jake had let the family business die. In the dream, his father would point to all the airplanes they used to service, all the customers who used to trust them, all the good work they used to do. Then Jake would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like he'd failed not just himself but his father's memory too. Some days Jake thought about just walking away, letting the bank take the hangar, selling what equipment he could and getting a regular job somewhere. Maybe Lisa had been right. Maybe he was just being stubborn, holding on to something that wasn't meant to survive in today's world. But every time he seriously considered giving up, Jake would remember something his father had told him years ago. "Son," the old man had said, "this business isn't just about fixing airplanes, it's about helping people. When someone's got a problem with their plane, they're counting on us to get them back in the air safely. That's a responsibility you don't take lightly." Those words kept Jake going even when everything else seemed hopeless. He wasn't just trying to save a business. He was trying to preserve something his father had built with his own hands, something that had served the community for over 30 years. Tonight was one of those nights when giving up seemed like the smart choice. Jake sat on a rusty folding chair in the middle of the empty hangar, surrounded by the ghosts of better times, wondering if tomorrow would finally be the day he admitted defeat. Jake was lying under a small Cessna, fighting with a stubborn bolt that refused to budge when his phone started ringing. The sound echoed weirdly in the empty hangar, and for a moment he considered just letting it go to voicemail. It was almost midnight, and he'd been working for 14 straight hours trying to finish this repair job that was already 3 days overdue. But something made him slide out from under the plane and grab his phone. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the fact that he couldn't afford to miss any potential work, no matter what time someone called. The number on the screen wasn't one he recognized, but these days, Jake answered every call that came in. "Johnson Aviation Services," he said, trying to sound more awake than he felt. The voice on the other end was frantic, almost panicked. It was a woman, talking fast and breathing hard like she'd been running. "I need a mechanic right now. We have an emergency situation at the private terminal. Our aircraft is down and we need immediate assistance." Jake sat up straighter. Emergency calls were rare, but they usually paid well. "What kind of aircraft are we talking about? And what's the problem?" "It's a Gulfstream G650. We're getting warning lights on the starboard engine and the pilot says we can't take off until it's checked out. We're at Peterson Private Aviation, Gate 7. How quickly can you get here?" Jake's mind started racing. A Gulfstream G650 wasn't your average small plane. These were serious aircraft, the kind that cost more than most people would see in a lifetime. The fact that someone was calling him instead of one of the big maintenance companies probably meant they were desperate, which could work in his favor. "I can be there in 30 minutes, Jake said, already reaching for his toolbox. "But I have to warn you, if this is major engine work, it might take—" "Just get here as fast as you can," the woman interrupted. "Money isn't an issue, we just need this fixed tonight." The line went dead and Jake stared at his phone for a moment. In 10 years of running this business, he'd never had someone tell him that money wasn't an issue. Usually that was the first thing people worried about. But emergency calls were different, and if this woman was telling the truth about paying well, this job could be exactly what Jake needed to buy himself some more time with the bank. He threw his tools into the back of his old pickup truck, and drove through the empty streets toward the private aviation terminal on the other side of the airport. The whole way there, Jake tried to remember everything he knew about Gulfstream engines. They were sophisticated machines, much more complex than the small planes he usually worked on. But the basic principles were the same. An engine was an engine, whether it was on a crop duster or a corporate jet. The private terminal was a different world from the part of the airport where Jake usually worked. Everything was clean and modern, with fancy lighting and perfectly manicured landscaping. Security was tight too. Jake had to show his mechanic's license and get a temporary pass just to drive onto the tarmac. When he saw the Gulfstream sitting on the runway, Jake had to whistle under his breath. The thing was absolutely beautiful. All sleek lines and polished metal, gleaming under the airport lights. He'd seen planes like this in magazines, but never up close. Just looking at it, Jake could tell this aircraft was worth more money than his entire neighborhood. Standing next to the plane was the woman who'd called him. She was probably in her late 30s, dressed in an expensive-looking business suit despite the late hour. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she was holding a phone to her ear while pacing back and forth near the aircraft's wing. Even from a distance, Jake could tell she was used to being in charge of things. As he got closer with his toolbox, Jake could hear pieces of her conversation. She was talking about board meetings and time zones and something about a merger that had to happen in the next 24 hours. Her voice was calm and professional, but Jake could hear the stress underneath. Whatever was happening, this flight delay was causing her serious problems. When she saw Jake approaching, she ended her call and walked over to meet him. Up close, she looked even more polished and put together than she had from a distance. Her clothes probably cost more than Jake made in a month, and her confidence was the kind that came from years of making important decisions and having people listen to her. "Are you the mechanic?" she asked, looking Jake up and down. He was suddenly very aware of his grease-stained work clothes and the fact that he probably smelled like motor oil and sweat. "Yes, ma'am, Jake Johnson. I got here as fast as I could." He gestured toward the Gulfstream. "Beautiful aircraft. What seems to be the problem?" The woman's expression was all business. "The pilot noticed some irregularities in the engine readings during our fuel stop. Warning lights, unusual vibrations, that sort of thing. He says he won't take off until someone checks it out, and frankly, I don't blame him." Jake nodded. Pilots who flew expensive jets like this one didn't take chances with safety, and for good reason. Smart pilot. Better to be safe than sorry with something like this. "I'm going to need to run some diagnostics. Maybe take a look at the engine itself. Do you know how long you've been getting these warning signs?" "They started about an hour into our last flight segment. We were hoping it was just a sensor malfunction, but the problems got worse as we flew." She paused, checking her phone again. "Look, I need to be completely honest with you. I have a meeting in Tokyo tomorrow evening that absolutely cannot be delayed. This isn't just important, it's make or break for my company. If I miss this meeting, it's going to cost a lot of people their jobs." Jake could hear the urgency in her voice, and he understood the pressure she was under. He'd felt that same desperation himself plenty of times over the past few years. "I'll do everything I can to get you back in the air as quickly as possible, but I can't make any promises until I see what we're dealing with." "I understand," she said. "The pilot is inside getting some coffee. His name is Captain Rodriguez, and he's been flying for 25 years. He'll be able to answer any technical questions you have." As Jake started unpacking his diagnostic equipment, he couldn't help but notice how the woman kept checking her phone and looking at her watch. She was trying to stay calm, but the stress was obvious. Whatever this meeting in Tokyo was about, it was clearly the most important thing in her world right now. "Can I ask what you do?" Jake said as he set up his laptop to connect to the aircraft's computer systems. "I mean, what kind of meeting is so important that it can't be delayed even by a day or two?" She hesitated for a moment, like she was deciding how much to tell him. "I run a technology company. We're in the final stages of a merger that would create the largest clean energy research firm in the world. The other parties are only available for a very narrow window, and if we miss it, the deal falls apart. 6 months of negotiations down the drain." Jake whistled softly. He was definitely out of his league here. This wasn't just about fixing an airplane. He was potentially holding up a deal that could change the world. No pressure at all. Jake plugged his diagnostic computer into the Gulfstream system and watched as streams of data started flowing across his screen. At first glance, most of the readings looked normal, but as he dug deeper into the engine parameters, he started to see what had worried the pilot. The starboard engine was showing pressure fluctuations that shouldn't be there, temperature spikes that came and went randomly, and fuel flow irregularities that were getting worse over time. "This isn't good," Jake muttered under his breath, scrolling through more data. The businesswoman, who had introduced herself simply as Victoria, was standing behind him trying to read the screen over his shoulder. "What exactly does not good mean?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. Jake rubbed his forehead, trying to think of the best way to explain it. "Your fuel injection system is having serious problems. The computer is detecting inconsistent fuel pressure, which means the engine isn't getting a steady supply of fuel. That's what's causing the rough running and the warning lights." Victoria's face went pale. "Can you fix it?" "That's the million-dollar question," Jake said, closing his laptop. "I need to get a visual look at the actual engine components to see what's going on. Could be a clogged fuel line, could be a failing pump, could be a dozen other things, but first, I need to get this engine cover off." Jake had worked on plenty of aircraft engines, but the Gulfstream was in a completely different league from the small planes he usually serviced. Everything was more complex, more precise, and frankly more intimidating. The engine compartment was packed with components he recognized in principle, but had never actually worked on before. Using a combination of his own tools and some specialized equipment he borrowed from the airport's maintenance facility, Jake carefully removed the engine cowling to expose the heart of the problem. What he found made his stomach drop. "Well, there's your problem," he said, pointing to a component deep inside the engine. "The high-pressure fuel pump is leaking internally. See that fuel residue around the housing? That pump is supposed to maintain constant pressure, but it's failing, which is why you're getting those erratic readings." Victoria leaned in to look where Jake was pointing, though he doubted she could see what he was talking about. "So you just replaced the pump, right? How long does that take?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, which clearly made Victoria nervous. "It's not that simple," he finally said. "This isn't a part I can just pick up at the local auto parts store. This is a specialized component that costs about $30,000, and it has to be ordered directly from the manufacturer. Even if I could get one tonight, which I can't, it would take at least 12 hours to properly install and test." The look on Victoria's face was heartbreaking. Jake could see her calculating the time in her head, realizing that her crucial meeting in Tokyo was slipping away. She turned and walked a few steps away, pulling out her phone to make what sounded like a very difficult call. "David, it's me," she said into the phone. "We have a problem. The plane is down with engine trouble, and it's going to take at least a day to fix, maybe longer." There was a pause as she listened to whoever was on the other end. "I know what this means for the merger. I know what we stand to lose." Jake felt terrible. Here was someone who was clearly trying to do something important, something that would help a lot of people, and he was the one who had to tell her it wasn't going to happen. He'd been in her shoes plenty of times, facing impossible deadlines, with no good options. But as Jake stared at the failing fuel pump, an idea started forming in his mind. It was crazy, probably impossible, and definitely not something he'd recommend under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, and sometimes crazy ideas were the only ones that worked. "Victoria," he called out. She held up a finger, finishing her phone conversation, then walked back over to where Jake was working. "The other board members are trying to find alternative dates," she said. But Jake could tell from her voice that she didn't think it was going to work. "What are our options here?" Jake took a deep breath. "Okay, I'm going to tell you something, and you're probably going to think I'm insane. That fuel pump is definitely shot, and normally you'd be right. We'd need to order a new one and install it properly. But I've seen this exact same failure before, on military aircraft when I was in the Air Force." "And?" Victoria prompted. "And sometimes when you're in the middle of nowhere with no parts available, you learn to get creative." Jake gestured toward his truck. "I've got a workshop full of salvaged parts back at my shop. Some of them came from civilian aircraft. some from military surplus. I think I might have components that could work as a temporary fix. Victoria's eyes lit up with hope. How temporary are we talking? If I can modify the parts to fit and get everything calibrated correctly, it should be good for at least one flight to Tokyo and back, maybe longer. But I have to be completely honest with you. This would be a field repair using non-standard components. It's not something I'd normally recommend for an aircraft this expensive. Victoria was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing her options. What's the worst-case scenario? Jake appreciated that she was asking the hard questions. Worst case? The repair doesn't work and you're stuck here anyway. Or it works initially but fails during flight, which would mean an emergency landing somewhere along the way. I can't guarantee anything with a jury-rigged repair like this. And best case? Best case, you make your meeting in Tokyo, save your merger, and get back home safely. Then you take the plane to a proper maintenance facility and have the fuel pump replaced correctly. Victoria looked at the engine, then at Jake, then at her phone showing the time. How long would this repair take? If everything goes right and I can find the parts I need at my shop, maybe 6 or 7 hours of work. But that's assuming I can adapt the components to fit and that my modifications actually work. What do you need from me? Jake was surprised by how quickly she'd made the decision. Just permission to try. And maybe some help carrying parts and tools. This is going to be an all-night job and I could use an extra pair of hands. Victoria nodded firmly. Let's do it. But I have one condition. What's that? I want to understand what you're doing every step of the way. If I'm trusting my life to this repair, I want to know exactly how it works. Jake couldn't help but smile. Most of his customers just wanted their planes fixed and didn't care about the details. Fair enough. Hope you're ready for a crash course in aircraft fuel systems. As they loaded Jake's tools back into his truck to make the trip to his shop, Victoria was already back on her phone, presumably calling off the search for alternative meeting dates. Jake could hear the excitement in her voice as she explained that they might still make the Tokyo flight after all. Driving through the empty streets toward his shop, Jake felt a familiar mix of excitement and terror that always came with taking on an impossible job. He'd pulled off crazy repairs before, but never on something this expensive, and never with stakes this high. If he succeeded, he'd not only save Victoria's business deal, but probably earn enough money to keep his own shop open for another few months. If he failed, well, he tried not to think about that possibility. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon when Jake finally stepped back from the Gulfstream's engine and wiped the sweat from his forehead. His hands were shaking slightly, partly from exhaustion and partly from the adrenaline that had been keeping him going for the past 7 hours straight. Victoria stood beside him, looking almost as tired as he felt. Her expensive business suit was now wrinkled and stained with grease. Her perfectly styled hair had come loose from its bun, and she had a smudge of oil on her left cheek. But her eyes were bright with anticipation as she stared at the engine they'd been working on all night. "So this is it?" she asked, her voice hoarse from hours of conversation and occasionally shouting over the sound of power tools. "We're really done?" Jake nodded, though he couldn't quite believe it himself. "The repair is complete. I've installed the modified fuel pump assembly, rerouted the pressure lines, and calibrated the fuel flow controllers. On paper, everything should work exactly like the original system." The night had been one of the most challenging of Jake's career. After driving back to his shop to gather parts, he'd spent 2 hours digging through his inventory of salvaged components, looking for pieces that might work in the Gulfstream's fuel system. Most of the parts he found were too big, too small, or designed for completely different types of aircraft. But Jake's military training had taught him to think creatively when standard solutions weren't available. He'd taken a fuel pump from a scrapped corporate jet, combined it with pressure regulators from a military transport plane, and connected everything using custom-fabricated fittings that he'd machined himself on his father's old lathe. Victoria had been a surprisingly good assistant throughout the process. Despite having no mechanical experience, she'd proven to be a quick learner and had helped with everything from holding flashlights to organizing tools to reading diagnostic data from Jake's computer. More importantly, she'd asked intelligent, Questions that had forced Jake to explain his reasoning for each modification, which had actually helped him catch a few potential problems before they became serious issues. "I have to admit," Victoria said, looking at the complex maze of fuel lines and components they'd installed, "when you first suggested this plan, I thought you were completely crazy. I've never seen anyone build a custom fuel system using spare parts in a pile of old tools." Jake laughed, though it came out sounding more nervous than amused. "To be honest, I wasn't completely sure it would work either. This is definitely the most complicated field repair I've ever attempted. Usually when I'm working on engines this sophisticated, I have access to proper equipment and genuine replacement parts. The real test, of course, would be starting the engines. All of their work for the past 7 hours would be meaningless if the modified fuel system didn't actually function when they tried to run the aircraft." Jake had checked and double-checked every connection, verified all the pressure settings, and run diagnostic tests on every component. But there was only one way to know for sure if the repair had been successful. "Are you ready for this?" Jake asked, gesturing toward the cockpit. Victoria took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be. What exactly are we looking for when we start it up?" "Smooth engine operation, steady fuel pressure readings, and no warning lights," Jake explained as they walked toward the front of the aircraft. "If the repair worked, the engine should sound just like the port-side engine. If something's wrong, we'll know pretty quickly." Captain Rodriguez, the pilot, had been catching a few hours of sleep in the airport's crew lounge while Jake and Victoria worked on the engine. Jake had called him 20 minutes ago to let him know they were ready for the engine test, and he was already in the cockpit running through pre-start procedures when they climbed aboard. "I have to say this is a first for me," the captain said, shaking Jake's hand. "In 25 years of flying, I've never had a mechanic completely rebuild a fuel system using salvaged parts. You're either brilliant or completely insane." "Probably a little bit of both," Jake admitted. "But the repair should be solid. I've tested every component individually and everything checks out." The captain nodded and began the engine startup sequence. "Okay, we'll start with the port engine first, just to make sure everything else is working normally. Then we'll fire up your custom fuel system and see what happens." The port engine came to life with the smooth, powerful hum that Jake had come to associate with well-maintained aircraft. All the instrument readings were exactly where they should be, and the engine sounded healthy and strong. "Port engine looks good," the captain announced. "Now, for the moment of truth. Starting starboard. Engine." Jake felt his heart racing as the captain initiated the startup sequence for the engine they'd spent all night repairing. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the engine began to turn over, faster and faster, until suddenly it caught and roared to life. The sound was beautiful. Instead of the rough, irregular noise that had characterized the failing fuel system, the starboard engine now hummed with the same smooth power as its counterpart. Jake watched the instrument panel intently, looking for any sign of trouble, but all the readings were exactly where they should be. "Fuel pressure is steady," the captain reported, his voice showing his surprise. "Temperature readings are normal. No warning lights, no irregular vibrations. I can't believe it, but this thing is running perfectly." Victoria let out a whoop of joy and grabbed Jake's arm. "It worked! I can't believe it actually worked!" Jake was staring at the instrument panel in amazement. Not only had the repair worked, but it was working better than he'd dared to hope. The modified fuel system was delivering performance that was virtually identical to the original equipment. "I want to run it for a few more minutes to make sure everything stays stable," the captain said. "But based on what I'm seeing here, this aircraft is ready to fly to Tokyo." Over the next 15 minutes, they ran the engines through various power settings, testing the fuel system under different operating conditions. Every test came back perfect. The custom fuel pump delivered steady pressure, the modified fuel lines handled the flow without any problems, and the calibrated controllers maintained precise fuel metering throughout the entire power range. "This is incredible work," Captain Rodriguez said, shutting down the engines. "I've seen factory-certified repairs that didn't perform this well. Where did you learn to do modifications like this?" Jake felt a flush of pride. "My father taught me the basics when I was growing up. Then the Air Force taught me how to think outside the box when standard solutions aren't available. But honestly, I've never attempted anything quite this complex before." Victoria was practically glowing with excitement. "We can still make the Tokyo meeting. The merger is back on track. Jake, you just saved my company." But even as Victoria celebrated, Jake was thinking about the bigger picture. This repair would get the Gulf Stream safely to Tokyo and back, but it was still a temporary fix. Victoria would need to have the fuel pump properly replaced with genuine parts as soon as possible. "I need to give you some very important instructions about this repair," Jake said seriously. "This modified system should be reliable for your trip to Tokyo, but it's not a permanent solution. You need to get that fuel pump replaced with the proper part within the next 2 weeks." Victoria nodded, her expression becoming more serious. "I understand. This gets us through the emergency, but then we do it right." As they prepared for departure, Jake realized that something fundamental had changed during their long night of working together. Victoria was no longer just a customer who needed her plane fixed. Somehow, over the course of 7 hours of shared problem-solving, they'd become a team. 3 days had passed since the Gulf Stream had disappeared into the morning sky, carrying Victoria to her crucial meeting in Tokyo. Jake had watched the aircraft taxi down the runway and take off, feeling a strange mix of pride and emptiness. The successful repair had been the highlight of his career, but now he was back to reality. Back to his struggling shop, back to the foreclosure notices, back to wondering if he'd have a business next week. Jake was under the hood of an old Cessna when he heard a familiar sound that made his heart skip a beat. The distinctive whine of jet engines, but not just any jet engines. He knew that sound now. It was the Gulf Stream, and it was coming back. He rolled out from under the plane and walked outside just in time to see the sleek aircraft touching down on the runway. His modified fuel system had worked perfectly for the entire trip to Tokyo and back. Jake felt a surge of satisfaction knowing that his crazy midnight repair had held up under real flight conditions. 20 minutes later, Victoria walked into his hangar, but she looked completely different from the stressed businesswoman he'd met 3 nights ago. She was smiling, relaxed, and carrying what looked like a bottle of expensive champagne and a folder full of papers. "Jake," she called out as soon as she saw him. "We did it. The merger went through perfectly. The meeting couldn't have gone better." Jake grinned and wiped his hands on a rag. "That's fantastic news. How did the engines perform during the flight?" "Like a dream. Captain Rodriguez said he couldn't tell any difference between your custom fuel system and the original equipment. He was so impressed that he spent half the flight asking me questions about you and your background." Victoria set the champagne and papers down on Jake's workbench and looked around the hangar with new eyes. During their all-night repair session, she'd been too focused on the work to really notice Jake's shop. But now she was taking it all in. The old tools, the makeshift equipment, the years of accumulated grease and oil stains that told the story of decades of hard work. "I have to ask you something," Victoria said, her tone becoming more serious. "That night when we were working on the engine, you mentioned that you learned some of your skills in the Air Force. What was your specialty?" Jake shrugged, not sure where she was going with this. "Aircraft maintenance, mostly on transport planes and fighters. I was what they called a crew chief, responsible for keeping the aircraft mission ready no matter what problems came up. Sometimes that meant following the manual exactly, but sometimes it meant getting creative when the manual didn't have answers. And before that, what made you want to work on airplanes in the first place?" Jake found himself telling Victoria the whole story, how his father had built this business from nothing, how Jake had grown up in this very hangar learning to love aircraft, how he joined the military to get better training, and how he'd come back to take over the family business when his father died. Victoria listened intently, asking questions that showed she really understood what the business meant to Jake and his family. She asked about his father's reputation in the community, about the types of aircraft they'd serviced over the years, and about Jake's vision for what the shop could become if he had the resources to grow it. "I did some research on you after I got back from Tokyo," Victoria said finally. "I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to understand who I was dealing with. Your military service record is impressive. Commendations for technical innovation, leadership awards, recognition for solving problems that stumped other mechanics." Jake felt uncomfortable with the praise. "I was just doing my job." No, you were doing much more than that. And it's not just your military record. I talked to some of your customers, people who've been bringing their planes to your father's shop for years. They all said the same thing, that you're the most skilled mechanic they've ever worked with, but that you're struggling because you don't have the business resources to compete with the bigger companies. Victoria paused and picked up the folder she'd brought with her. That got me thinking about something. My company owns 12 aircraft now, and we're planning to expand our fleet significantly over the next few years. We spend over $2 million annually on aircraft maintenance, split between several different service providers. Jake wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but he had a feeling it was about to change his life. The thing is, Victoria continued, none of those service providers have ever done anything like what you did for me 3 nights ago. None of them would have even attempted that repair. They would have told me to wait for factory parts and standard procedures, and my merger would have fallen apart. She opened the folder and pulled out what looked like a business proposal. I want to offer you a partnership, Jake, not just as a customer, but as a real business partner. Jake's eyes widened. What kind of partnership? I want to invest in your shop. Complete modernization, new equipment, expanded facilities, certification to work on larger aircraft. In exchange, you become the primary maintenance provider for all of Sterling Innovation's aircraft. But more than that, I want to help you build this into the kind of operation your father would have been proud of. Jake stared at the papers in Victoria's hands, hardly believing what he was hearing. Why would you do this? I mean, you barely know me. Victoria smiled. I know enough. I know that you're incredibly skilled at what you do. I know that you have integrity. You could have charged me 10 times what you did for that emergency repair, but you didn't. I know that you care about doing things right, not just doing them fast. And I know that you saved my company when nobody else could have. She pulled out another document. But this isn't just charity, Jake. This is good business. The aviation industry is growing rapidly, and skilled maintenance providers are in high demand. With the right investment and partnership, this shop could become one of the premier aircraft service centers in the region. Jake looked around his father's old hangar, trying to imagine it transformed into the kind of modern facility Victoria was describing. New equipment, proper lighting, maybe even room to hire additional mechanics and expand the types of services they could offer. There's one more thing, Victoria said. I don't just want you to maintain my aircraft. I want you to join my team. As Director of Aviation Operations, you'd oversee all aspects of our flight operations, from maintenance to safety to pilot training. It would mean regular travel, working with aircraft manufacturers, and helping to shape the future of our aviation program. Jake felt overwhelmed. A week ago, he'd been facing foreclosure and wondering if he'd have to give up his father's business. Now Victoria was offering him a chance not just to save the shop, but to build it into something bigger than he'd ever imagined. I need some time to think about this, Jake said finally. Victoria nodded. Of course, but I hope you'll say yes, Jake. You saved my merger, but more than that, you showed me what real expertise and dedication look like. I want that kind of person on my team. As Victoria prepared to leave, she turned back to Jake one more time. You know, that night when we were working on the engine, I learned something important. I've built my career on recognizing talent and potential, but I'd never met anyone who could turn an impossible situation into a success story the way you did. That's exactly the kind of thinking my company needs. Jake watched Victoria walk out to her waiting car, his mind racing with possibilities. The partnership she was offering would change everything, not just for him, but for his father's legacy and for all the customers who had supported the business over the years. Looking around the hangar one more time, Jake could almost hear his father's voice telling him that sometimes the biggest opportunities come disguised as the biggest problems. 3 nights ago, Victoria had been a stranger with a broken airplane. Now she was offering him a chance to build the future he'd always dreamed of but never thought possible.